So I'll sit down until you start. Okay.
All right, good morning. Good morning, folks. Thanks for coming out in the rain. Everybody dry? You made it? What a storm it was this morning, so appreciate you braving that and being here. My name is Mark Wensler. I direct the Climate Change Initiative here at Chautauqua Institution. I also am a proud partner of the Chautauqua Science Group. We collaborate on this weekly Tuesday lecture series, and so pleased to have all of you here today. I want to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. David Michaels, who is, and I need my reading glasses for this. No matter how big I make the font, I still need them. David's an epidemiologist and professor at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health. He's held high-level public health positions in the administrations of Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. Nominated by President Obama and unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate, Dr. Michaels served as Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA from 2009 to 2017 and was the longest-serving administrator in OSHA's history. Earlier in his career, he served as the Department of Energy's Assistant Secretary for Environment, Safety, and Health, where he had primary responsibility for protecting the health and safety of workers, neighboring communities, and the environment surrounding the nation's nuclear weapons facilities. Dr. Michaels is a leader in efforts to protect the integrity of science underpinning public health and environmental protections. His book, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money, and the Science of Deception, was called a tour de force by the reviewer in Science magazine, and a brave and important book by the reviewer in Nature. He is also the author of Doubt is Their Product, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2008 and reissued in 2023. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. David Michaels.
Thank you, Mark. Thank all of you for coming out on a day like this. So I recently learned that the traditional PowerPoint is not really going to be very effective here because of the size of the screen. So I've sort of made my talk a little bit of a hybrid. I still have a few slides that I'm going to read because I think it'll be hard to read, but if people in the back want to move forward, there certainly are some seats up here. Let's see how this works. Okay. So you heard a lot about me, so I don't really need to talk about who I am. And as you heard, I've written 2 books, and really they're sort of a passion of mine. I really am interested in this question of what's going on in science, and why is sort of science under attack, which it is now, and this is something I've really been writing about and thinking about for about 20 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's start here. Public health protections, something we all care deeply about. We sometimes call them regulations. And regulations or standards or rules have sort of this connotation that, this is someone telling us something we need to do and maybe we don't want to do. But when I think of them as public health protections, these are things that are really necessary to protect all of us. And, we've had public health protections since ancient history. The ancient Sumerians actually had quarantine long before the Italians figured out quarantine, in the Middle Ages when infectious diseases spread. A lot of the early public health protections, of course, were based on observation, and it's really science. I mean, when the ancients saw certain things happening, they said, well, we need to prevent them in the future, we need to protect the public. So the ancients had rules, for example, that when you build a house or a building, you put guardrails around that house because people could fall, and that's based on experience of people falling. I like to start with that example because, as you heard from Mark, I ran OSHA under President Obama, certainly the most meaningful job I ever had. The mission of the agency is to protect workers in jobs that could destroy their limbs, their lungs, or take their lives. And I think it's when we think about the public health protections for workers as compared to public health protections for the rest of us, you have to recognize that society undervalues the lives of workers. Workers are expected to take what we think, many of us think would be unacceptable risks. There's little awareness in this country that between 3 and 5 million workers are injured on the job every year. We actually don't know exactly how many there are because we have such terrible reporting systems. But we know that about 15 workers are killed on the job every day. That's literally killed by traumatic injury on the job every day. And of course, these are just the statistics. As I remind my students, statistics are human beings with the tears washed off. Every day there are 15 people who don't return home to their families at the end of their work shift. And no matter what political party has controlled the White House or Congress, OSHA has remained a tiny, under-resourced agency. And that's because workers have very little power in this country. The people who do have power in this country have little awareness or perhaps just little care about the workers who do dangerous jobs. I think everyone in this room has witnessed this. You may not have thought about it this way, but let's go back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The most powerful people in this country, corporate executives, finance leaders, attorneys, and so on, and many of us, including academics like myself, switched to Zoom to do our work, right? But workers who we called essential, that's all we did for them. We called them essential. They cared for our sick and our older people, who ensured food was harvested, processed, delivered to our stores and our homes, who operated our public transportation systems. These workers risked their lives, and many of them lost their lives, keeping our economy going and our society functioning. I sometimes ask people for a thought experiment. What would have happened if we had no Zoom? And all of us who were working had to actually go into the office every day, go into their workplaces every day. There would be a national outcry how to make those places safe, but we never did that. And the federal government under either Donald Trump or Joe Biden did precious little to make those jobs safer. Now the pandemic is past, but thousands still work in dangerous jobs. Poultry workers whose hands are destroyed by standing on freezing assembly lines, making 20 or more repetitive cuts every minute. Latino men fabricating the kitchen countertops you can order at Costco. You can walk in and say, I want a countertop that looks like marble, having no idea that making those countertops is destroying the lungs of these young men. Those lungs are so ravaged by breathing silica dust, they need lung transplants after 10 or 15 years on the job. So this is public health. Like medicine, public health advances are built on scientific discovery. But because we focus on populations rather than individuals, applying those advances usually requires actions by government agencies. And those agencies and those laws that govern those agencies have been conceptualized and structured by legislators who, for the most part, they're not scientists, they're attorneys. So we have a public health system that's driven by scientific advances, but the application of those advances is also shaped, and I would say distorted, by a legal concept about which we're all familiar, but which is misapplied in this case. And that concept? The presumption of innocence. Now, we've all heard about presumption of innocence, right? Perry Mason, Law and Order. It's reinforced by movies, by television. A person is innocent until proven guilty, right? And we all think that's a great idea. It is. And that guilt must be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? 12 unanimous jurors, you've seen the movies, etc. So our legislators, and really pushed by industry lobbyists, I think Mark can talk about this a little bit at some point, having been working on the Capitol Hill, took that treasured criminal justice principle and applied it to public health. So we've built public health systems that demand proof of harm before requiring anyone to act. And we take this for granted, it's rarely questioned, but it doesn't have to be this way. I don't think that hazards should be presumed innocent. So sometimes applying public health principles is pretty straightforward. The ancients knew that unguarded roofs are dangerous, and so OSHA requires employers to provide roofers with that fall protection I showed you before. But some risks are less obvious, and proving the relationship between a hazard and a harm is often more difficult. It's not so clear. Under OSHA law and the law that govern many other public health agencies, the agencies have to prove that people are already being hurt before issuing those regulations that could prevent future lives lost. So we call that the body in the morgue method. When life-saving actions interfere with profits, even when there are many bodies in the morgue, protecting the public, and especially protecting workers, becomes much more challenging. The innocence presumption is manipulated or distorted, often by manufacturing doubt about the scientific evidence. That's what I write about. And when protecting people interferes with profits, the innocence presumption gets weaponized through manufacturing doubt about the science. Now, you know the story. For decades, the tobacco industry ran a very successful disinformation campaign about the harms of cigarettes dating back many decades. Now, you will, and this really has become what I'll call standard operating procedure. I'll read this because it's now standard operating procedure for corporations and now the U.S. government to create and disseminate scientific disinformation by manufacturing uncertainty about potential harms caused by their products or activities. So the tobacco industry, and this predates, in 1950 were the first studies that really definitively showed that tobacco is linked with lung cancer. And it was only in the 1950s because people in the United States didn't start smoking seriously until the 1920s, really World War I, when soldiers were given free tobacco when they were stationed in Europe, free cigarettes. So the epidemic didn't start until the late 30s, 1940s. We had a war. You couldn't do the studies. But by 1950, we had pretty definitive studies linking tobacco and lung cancer. But even before that, people were worried about inhaling smoke, and so the tobacco industry regularly published these studies, not really based on anything. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, scientific evidence on the effects of smoking. It's not bad for you. But then it became very clear by 1950 that if you smoke tobacco, you were at greater risk for lung cancer. And once those studies came out, the industry essentially followed the advice of a public relations firm, Hill & Knowlton, and they went to action. And we have the receipts. We have the documents where the tobacco industry, the tobacco executives describe their campaign in writing. The most famous of these is a memo written by an executive of the Brown and Williamson Company who wrote, "Doubt is our product," not tobacco, "doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also the means of establishing controversy." And they understood that. They could never tell you at that point that tobacco was safe, but they said, well, there's a lot of uncertainty, so you have to figure it out. Look, you should read the literature yourself and you make the decision. But they spent a lot of time creating doubt, sending out information. My favorite of these, and you won't be able to read this no matter where you're sitting, but this is a newsletter sent out by the tobacco industry to scientists and physicians every 2 months called Tobacco and Health Research. And the idea was controversy. Anything that showed that either tobacco was safe or that something else caused lung cancer was what they promoted. So I think many of us will appreciate this headline: "Lung cancer rare in bald men." And we call it the tobacco strategy, the tobacco playbook, not because tobacco invented it. Actually, you could date it back beforehand. The paint industry and lead industry did that around lead paint. But the tobacco industry spread disinformation earlier. They did longer. They did it better. And they made billions in profits while killing millions of smokers across the globe along the way. Now, we've seen that same strategy from the fossil fuel industry, enabling oil and coal companies to produce and burn the greenhouse gases that are causing climate crisis. Another slide you're not going to be able to read, so I'll read you the key thing. This is a memo by a guy named Frank Luntz. Anyone know who Frank Luntz is? A couple of people. You see him sometimes if you watch Fox News, but he's a sort of a guy who talks about, his card says, "It's not what you say, it's what they hear." How do you make your phrases influential? And he does focus groups and things like that. So he wrote a memo to the Republican Party or the Republican National Committee saying, "The scientific debate remains open. Voters believe there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe the scientific issues are settled, their view about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate." Now, that's sort of past. I think at this point, people's views on the science is pretty set, and a lot of their views are shaped by, I think, tribal beliefs. But this really helped shape all that. Exxon and other fossil fuel companies paid for a book that was sent to every high school science teacher in the country, saying why scientists disagree about global warming. And of course, it's now coming out in great detail that the fossil fuel companies all knew exactly what was going on and the likelihood that burning carbon in the environment, releasing methane, things like that, were going to lead to exactly the sort of crisis that we're seeing right now. So creating doubt science has become standard operating procedures for many industries, the asbestos industry, pesticide producers. People follow now probably these PFAS, this fluorinated or forever chemicals. The sugar industry. Even the National Football League, for more than a decade, manufactured doubt about how the game was damaging the brains of players, essentially saying that there's too much uncertainty, until autopsies made their lives impossible to sustain. So this is really what I call, actually the industry made up this phrase, not me, product defense. And it's defense, just like criminal defense, but this is defending a product. It really is public relations, but it's disguised as science. There are a couple of basic descriptions of it, that scientists and scientific consulting firms are hired to defend products in the regulatory or legal arenas or on TV, to change the public's view. The value of these scientists, unfortunately, is their ability to influence regulation, litigation, and public opinion, not actually to provide any sort of valid or useful science, and the science they produce is really questionable, but scientists rarely get into the discussion with them. They'll publish papers in so-called peer-reviewed journals that they control, which are garbage, but most scientists don't waste their time trying to comment on them, trying to oppose them, because why bother doing that? So let's talk about an example. I like to talk about some, so we'll put this up. So I first witnessed this up close. You heard I served as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Environment, Safety, and Health during the Clinton administration. Now it's called the Department of Energy, or DOE, but that name is intentionally misleading, since for traditionally, and still, much of the work of the Energy Department has little to do with sort of energy as we think about it. In fact, when I was there, the fossil fuel division, the Office of Fossil Fuel, which dealt with oil, coal, and gas, was located in the basement of the annex of the headquarters. So what does DOE do? DOE makes nuclear weapons. And a big portion of the budget is making nuclear weapons. Another big portion of the budget is cleaning up the mess we made making nuclear weapons. So my job, I was charged with protecting workers, the communities, and the environment around these nuclear weapons productions, testing, and cleanup facilities, which are some of the most polluted places in the United States, like Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos are some of the more well-known ones. I particularly got involved with a material called beryllium, which is a very important component of nuclear weapons. Essentially, the package which leads to the giant explosion, it's either uranium or plutonium, is wrapped in beryllium, and so it increases the detonation, increases the bomb's explosive power. So it's a really important metal. It's lighter than aluminum, it's stronger than steel, and even tiny exposures can result in the person exposed getting chronic beryllium disease, which is a terrible lung disease. It can be fatal. When I arrived at DOE, there were dozens of workers who were already sick, and we needed a stronger standard. But the industry, the beryllium industry, opposed it because that would impact their facilities all around the country, even though we weren't covering it by the standard. So they hired one of the product defense firms, one that had worked for Big Tobacco, to write a scientific paper, publish it in a peer-reviewed journal saying, yes, workers were getting sick, but more research was needed before we should do anything about it. Of course, I said that's nonsense. We don't have to accept that, and we didn't. We knew enough to protect people, and we issued a standard that cut exposure by 90%. Eventually, at OSHA, 15 years later, I issued a very similar standard. But that experience dealing with the beryllium industry, who was using tobacco, the tobacco playbook, opened my eyes. And in doing my research, I read a memo actually written by Hill and Knowlton executives offering their services to the beryllium industry. They said, beryllium has a public relations problem, we can help you deal with this. And it listed a lot of the work that they did. They never actually even said in the memo that they worked for tobacco, but they worked for asbestos and for a bunch of other chemical manufacturers. And the example they gave, which particularly blew me away, and I'll read this. This is called fluorocarbons and ozone depletion. And this is why you should hire Hill and Knowlton. Here's the problem, and you'll see how this is posed not as a public health problem, but within the same vocabulary as criminal justice. Scientific allegations, right, an allegation, we don't really use that word in science a lot, we say hypotheses or things like that. Scientific allegations that fluorocarbons released from aerosol spray cans were a threat to the Earth's ozone layer, right? Everyone remember that? The Montreal Protocol eventually. The Earth's ozone layer had become a cause célèbre in the media and the government, despite the fact there was no real scientific proof of the charges, right? And it would be years before facts could be assembled. The media fastened on the threat of increased skin cancer and the doomsday aspect of the story. Public concern and fear about the future caused fluorocarbon users to look to alternatives. So that's the problem. The fluorocarbon users would look for a different product. Hill and Knowlton was asked by DuPont to help calm fears, get better reporting of the issues, and gain up to 2 to 3 years before the government took action to ban fluorocarbons. That worked. They got 2 or 3 more years. DuPont actually never lost market share. They had a new product. But the ozone hole just grew for 2 or 3 more years, right? Now, it turns out the science was pretty good. In fact, a few years later, the 3 people who figured it out got the Nobel Prize. But that's meaningless in this situation. So after I left DOE, I sort of started researching the product defense industry. I moved from City College, where I used to work before in New York, to George Washington University. I started diving down into rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and I found a lot of these same product defense scientists who had worked for tobacco, who had worked for beryllium, now were producing disinformation for corporations in a wide range of industries. In fact, I found this on the web. This was a case study. Let's see. That's going to be hard to read. I thought I had copied that. Maybe we'll just skip that. So this is how they market themselves. This is from a different company that sold products. Asbestos, tobacco, pharmaceuticals were all next. Scare science, the loss of presumptive innocence. Right, so they understand this, that presumptive innocence is what they use to make sure products are not regulated until we understand beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's dangerous. And of course, it's all about liability also. Where will liability end? You know, asbestos companies got sued, tobacco companies got sued, pharmaceutical companies got sued. You know, you're next, hire us. That's the basic model there. So this led to my first book, Doubt is Their Product. Of course, I just didn't have trouble finding a title for it. I just went back to that memo from Brown and Williamson. And in that book, I reported on how some of America's leading corporations, DuPont, ExxonMobil, Ford Motor, Merck, created and disseminated scientific disinformation. Now, fortunately, it turned out that very few Republicans had read my book. So when President Obama nominated me to run OSHA, I was confirmed, as you heard, unanimously by the Senate. It's a long, funny story, which I could tell you over lunch or something. So I ran OSHA for more than 7 years. I was the longest serving, or perhaps longest surviving head of the agency. But in that role, I came up against that same presumption of innocence. To issue standards that protect workers from significant harms, we had to prove the hazard was sufficiently dangerous. You know, we had to count the bodies in the morgue. And we had to overcome by objections by corporations who would be required to invest in better protection for workers. And their strategy, no surprise here, hire those same high-priced scientists to create doubt, no matter how strong the scientific evidence. So one thing we did, we issued a rule to reduce exposure to silica, which we've known really for centuries causes silicosis. So the industry hired experts to make the most outlandish claims. They said, for example, we hadn't proven that silica causes silicosis. There were hundreds of studies. That wasn't so difficult for us. But that same expert, who is a very well-respected regulatory mathematician, actually, who has a faculty appointment at George Washington University, among other places, and was a major appointee in the first Trump administration, at a different hearing by the Mine Safety and Health Administration, where they were trying to strengthen regulation of for coal dust exposure, which causes coal workers pneumoconiosis. He testified the problem isn't coal dust, it's silica. You know, they'll say whatever you pay them to say, they'll say, because that's the business model. If they produce reports, if they produce testimony that their client doesn't use, doesn't like, doesn't help them, they don't get more jobs. And it's a very lucrative industry. So this is what the public health agencies are up against. An industry, a very lucrative industry, that's designed to stop public health progress. So how do you explain the behavior of these scientists? I've often been asked, you know, how do the defenders of tobacco or asbestos or PFAS, how do they sleep at night? So I think you have to think about what's called sometimes in psychology motivated reasoning. The tendency to find arguments in favor of conclusions we want to believe to be stronger than arguments for conclusions we don't want to believe. And I think that was summarized well by Upton Sinclair, the author and at one time candidate for governor of California, who wrote, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." So I've tried to look at sort of some newer quotes to capture the same thing. So I went on the website Glassdoor. Has anyone ever gone on Glassdoor? Yeah, a few hands. You know, you're looking for a job, and you want to know, is that company worth going to see, going to work for? And people put in their comments. And so I pulled up some of the companies that do this work. I'll read this again because I know it'll be hard to read it. Exponent is probably the biggest of these companies. It used to be actually called Failure Associates because it did automobile engineering things, but now they do a lot of work. They did work for tobacco, they work for all these different industries now. Someone recently wrote, "Obviously, clients pick this company because they are willing to expend people and resources to get the desired result. Often you will see legitimate science being thrown out, and many managers will go as far as perjuring themselves in open court for the client." So this is a Exponent employee saying this. Or a company called ChemRisk. "This is a law consulting company, not a science consulting company. Don't expect to be a scientist." Or Gradient, which is a company up in Cambridge, all these people with PhDs from Harvard. It looks really like an impressive company. "The environmental work at Gradient doesn't defend the environment, but helps companies who are polluting the environment." So these are the firms the corporations bring in when public health agencies are confident the science is strong enough to justify public health protections. Let me say that again. When public health agencies have enough information that, you know, they got the bodies in the morgue to move forward, that's when these companies are brought in. But what about the thousands of chemicals we've never adequately studied? Take PFAS, you know, these forever chemicals. There are at least 15,000 different PFAS compounds, 15,000 different forever chemicals. We have human data on a handful, less than a dozen, and we can't test them all. You know, how could we? So we need to limit exposure to entire classes of chemicals, even if we don't have complete data or even very little, if we have very little data at all. But industry insists, and the laws in fact insist, that we have to count the bodies in the morgue before we regulate each chemical, and we can't let that happen. As you heard, one of the things I'll be talking about tomorrow at there's a talk back at Best for Babies, is this whole experience dealing with Johnson & Johnson and talc, which I had the interesting experience of being asked to be involved in the very first case, or not the very first case, but the biggest case, one where the jurors essentially awarded 22 women with ovarian cancer $4 billion because they thought that Johnson & Johnson's behavior really was so terrible that they need to be given a lesson. It was all around these same issues. So anyway, this is the background of my books, what I've written about. This is all before Trump. These were the challenges we faced. Now, it's not going to surprise anyone in this room that the scientific enterprise in the United States is really under very vicious attack right now. What we're witnessing today is the decimation of federal science. In agencies, they're charged with protecting us. In agencies, they're charged with building the scientific base to move public health forward. In funding for academic independent academic researchers who create the evidence base for public health. Renowned scientists, including probably people who are regulars here at Chautauqua, have been pushed out. Research facilities have been shuttered. Studies abandoned in midstream. With the help of Elon Musk, who briefly was the world's first trillionaire, I'm told it's no longer the case. The Trump administration has disabled efforts by agencies to protect the public's health and safety. And they've even targeted agencies that focus on economic well-being as well. These agencies are being decimated. The government also has long relied on private sector experts to provide advice on complex scientific issues. There are numerous advisory committees that have simply stopped meeting. And scientists with certain personal characteristics or political affiliations were abruptly fired from those committees, where you don't get paid. You do it as a public service. But hundreds of scientists were fired with no reason given at all. I'm told that early in the administration, your chances of being dismissed from an NIH advisory committee were very high if you were a woman, an ethnic or racial minority, had a role in the Biden administration, or had a connection with Columbia University, remember, which was targeted at the very beginning. So I scored 2 out of 4, so I was fired pretty quickly from the NIH advisory committee I was on. But after the purges, in a few of the most high-profile committees that continued to function because by law they had to function, some of the nation's leading scientists were replaced by charlatans, or people who have significant financial conflicts of interest and who would stand to gain financially from the committee's decisions. We just saw that with the peptide decisions this week, if you follow that. People who literally make money selling peptides were brought in to vote on whether or not the FDA should allow selling of the products that they already market. So it's difficult to understand why the current administration has made draconian cuts in funding for research into treating childhood cancer, or Alzheimer's, or autism, or sickle cell disease, yet this is exactly what's happening right now. And disinformation is everywhere, and it's being spread from the highest levels of government, including and especially the White House. The Trump administration has taken the tobacco playbook to new heights, often in actions driven by corrupt and mercenary motives. So there's a phrase that you're going to hear more and more with the White House and officials in some of the other agencies asserting that gold standard science justifies rolling back public health protections. So let me give you an example here. There are lots of examples like this. I've written about them, but one I think sort of captures as well. For many years, the Food and Drug Administration has not permitted certain flavored vaping products which are popular among kids and teenagers to be sold. You can buy a menthol vaping product, but you can't buy bubblegum flavor vaping products. The idea is that that discourages, preteens from getting hooked on nicotine, because that's what vaping does. So vaping is great if you want to stop smoking, but you don't want to start with vaping, and that's sort of the difficulty, the conundrum FDA has always faced. What do you allow and what do you not allow? So the New York Times reported that one of the country's largest tobacco companies, Reynolds, gave $5 million to a Trump-aligned super PAC. Just days later, tobacco executives and lobbyists met with Mr. Trump at his Florida golf club. Obviously, he raised these issues. We weren't there, but we know this is what happened because a couple of days later, Trump then contacted senior Health and Human Services Department officials to complain that the FDA was blocking sales of some flavored vapes. So what did the FDA do? Well, less than a week later, with no additional scientific analysis, the FDA issued new guidance making it easier to sell those products. When asked, the White House announced the decision was driven by, yes, gold standard science. That's where we are now. So the phrase gold standard science, that refers to an executive order that President Trump signed a little more than a year ago, purportedly directing federal agencies to strengthen the quality of the science, to restore the gold standard, which has really been destroyed by the Biden administration, it says. Most of it read like, motherhood and apple pie. We have to have science should have reproducibility, transparency, peer review. I mean, all the basic stuff, pablum that you'd expect to see. But what it did, most importantly, was it gave political appointees, many of whom have absolutely no scientific training, the power to decide what counts as good science, as gold standard science, and the power to discipline or even fire federal scientists who dissent from their interpretation. So when that came out, I was asked to write an editorial for Science magazine in response, and I did that with a colleague, Wendy Wagner from the University of Texas. And just as we predicted in that editorial, the administration is now using this to manufacture uncertainty and justify dramatic decreases in public protection. RFK Jr., our Secretary of Health and Human Services, refuses to let CDC tell parents that it's safe to vaccinate their children. It's taken off the website. You can't say it's safe to vaccinate your children because, he says, science hasn't eliminated every conceivable pathway by which vaccines could contribute to autism. So this is beyond a shadow of a doubt, and this is not how science works, and certainly not how public health protection works. But that's, never mind that this issue has been studied exhaustively in many countries, different ways. There really is no reason to not encourage parents to vaccinate their kids. In fact, I just read in the paper that Trump is telling RFK Jr. to go even further to discourage vaccination. The EPA invoked gold standard science to roll back limits on forever chemicals in our drinking water, claiming that we need to know better science before we actually protect people. And we're not going to get that science under this administration or for a long time. And so that's where we are today. The tobacco playbook is in the White House and being used on a regular basis. And while I hate to be the bearer of only bad news, you may have heard about the most recent White House proposal that would formalize control by political appointees of all federal research, and even more than that, all federal grants. Essentially what it says is that political appointees, if this proposed rule goes through, could decide if a researcher or if a proposed study fits gold standard science, if the researcher has a career where he or she follows gold standard science, or the institution is a sort of consistent with gold standard science. If not, the political appointee can just say, well, we're not going to fund this. And it's not just NIH research, but every type of research and every type of study and program across the board. Now, it's not clear this proposed rule is necessary because they're doing it anyway. But they certainly would like the legal ability to do this because they're being taken to court. So just last week, the White House admitted it's doing exactly this. It had denied, the Energy Department, Chris Wright, who was the Energy Secretary, had denied that they canceled energy projects for political reasons, but it came out in a court case with lawyers who were not allowed to lie, said that yes, they canceled all the energy projects but one. There's hundreds of energy projects with one exception, only in states that support Kamala Harris. They just wiped them out. So here we are. At the moment, disinformation is rampant and being spread by our political leaders. Diseases like measles that had been under control are back. The EPA has virtually stopped enforcing anti-pollution laws. It's rolling back regulations, and the idea of putting out new ones is a pipe dream. And the effects of these changes, more childhood asthma, more cardiovascular disease deaths, more developmental harm from mercury, they're much harder to detect than the measles outbreak, but they surely are coming as well. So this isn't just about the integrity of science. It's about our future, our children's future, and the future of our planet. We've been in very dark places before, but eventually the sun does come out. When this administration ends, if we get the chance to rebuild, we need to learn from our mistakes. I'll wait on that. We need to ensure that scientific evidence is produced and interpreted by scientists who are free from financial conflict of interest. We must build structures that deter agency capture and the revolving door of people going in and out of agencies and industry. And we need to recognize the existence of real uncertainty and distinguish it from manufactured uncertainty. But we have to act even knowing there's uncertainty. We have to stop presuming that pollutants and toxic chemicals are safe until proven otherwise. We have to accept that uncertainty is inevitable and err on the side of protecting our communities, workers, and especially our children and grandchildren using the best evidence we have. So one final request. There is so much at stake. We have to be bold, creative, and courageous. So thank you all very much for listening. I'll take a few questions and comments. Yeah, and tell me who you are.
Hi, I'm Alice, and former math teacher and computer science teacher. What I'm really concerned, I'm concerned about a lot of this, but because of all these things that they're doing to scientists and funding, that scientists are not going to stay in the United States. They are going to go elsewhere, and it will take years for us to regain our shall I say, superiority or high level of scientific research, because we're losing so much. Can you comment on that?
No, it's true. I mean, a lot of very well-known scientists, I'm sure quite a few not well-known scientists, have accepted offers from other universities in other countries for obvious reasons. And there's no question, one of the discussions we have to be having now is, once this administration is gone, how do we rebuild? I don't have any, great ideas. I have some ideas, but it's a longer discussion to have. But we certainly have to think about rebuilding our institutions, rebuilding our federal agencies. If you've ever worked in a federal agency, how many people have ever been a Fed? Hiring in federal agencies is very challenging. It's easy to fire people, it turns out, but bringing them on, it's going to be very hard to rebuild these agencies now. And we have to think about new laws to allow us to bring back people and to essentially restore these things. And it'll be a challenge. Bob.
I've heard that some people in European legislatures have pushed an idea called the precautionary principle. Do you think that's an appropriate strategy to work towards in the U.S.? And if not, what is the reverse of presumptive innocence?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion here as well. Sometimes this is called the precautionary principle, this idea that you shouldn't allow something if we're not sure it's safe. And obviously, there's always trade-offs. We have to think about these things. There are a lot of decisions that are made that are, we ask people to do things even though there's not a lot of evidence that it's dangerous, but we can't risk that. For example, everybody is told to turn off your cell phones when airplanes are taking off, right? Has that prevented any crashes? We have no idea. Is it, it's based on limited evidence, but we think it's a good thing to do because it would be a terrible thing if the navigation system failed and things crashed. So you can make decisions based on what you think are the potential effects of the protection that you're putting in. I think the precautionary principle has been sort of labeled as being way over the top, and so people often don't use that phrase. But this idea that if we think reasonably this may be causing some harm down the line and it can be prevented, let's figure out the best way to prevent it within the context of what we can do. So, sir.
Sid Hollick, owner, 27 Vincent. Here's a real-life example on campus of the presumed innocent. This weekend, several of us experienced water discoloration, yellow, pink, and in one case at least brown. When the utility district was confronted with this, they said they had no obligation to notify us. The health department has actually said, we will only notify you if there is proven health risk. So there's an example, real life here on campus.
Right, no, that's the question, and how do you prove it? One of the great laws that was passed, which tells water districts they have to test water that's sent out to the consumers for certain contaminants and also microorganisms, and it doesn't even say that they have to do anything other than to actually tell people that they've tested and what the results are. And so that's actually a very effective way to encourage people to address the problem, at least think about the problem, but because if there's no requirement to test, you'll never know. So, Bob. Another Bob.
Yeah, I'd like to alert people to two ongoing, simple-sounding tricks to beguile us. My last two jobs at the State Department, I lobbied for the budget and then I educated foreign service officers about how to live in the modern world. I discovered that the chairman of appropriations committees could bludgeon, and they did this on behalf of us as taxpayers, bludgeon the people proposing a budget to say, okay, Mr. Comptroller, if I give you 95% of your budget, will you swear to me that you can do everything in your budget request? And to get the money, the people would all say, yeah, sure, I can do it. And then the next year when they came back, they hadn't been able to do everything.
Right.
And so they were cut another 5% and another. And these were by chairmen who didn't want them to do their jobs. So it was a win-win by being a lose-lose. But as a taxpayer, you're going to be told that they did you a great service by cutting your taxes. And they cutted science and programs. Then a big oil company helped us to educate our officers. They were doing conferences on alternative energy. They were doing all the things that just seemed right. We started endorsing them. They were wonderful. It turned out they were still doing every fossil fuel program, and they were the ones that had the oil derrick off of New Orleans explode.
BP?
Yeah, and they seemed wonderful.
Yeah.
And it was all
PR.
pretty close. It was PR, not science. And just pay attention.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, for those comments. Exxon regularly put ads in the newspaper. They used to have a little sort of quarter-page New York Times when people actually read the paper in paper, talking about all the great things they were doing on, reducing fossil fuel use. Turns out they spent more on the advertising than on the program to actually reduce fossil fuel use. And it wasn't much. Sir.
Andy Felcher from Portland, Oregon. Thanks very much for your talk. Andy Felcher from Portland, Oregon. And your comment about the proof of innocence thing was just so interesting. And in my training, one of the teachers I had used to say that in Europe, they don't do something, they do stuff until they know it's dangerous. We do stuff until we know it's dangerous. They don't do something until they know it's safe.
Yeah, we're following, that's what Bob raised, the precautionary principle.
And the other one, kind of from my training too, was that facts won't sway an emotional argument.
Yeah.
And so that speaks a lot to the vaccine thing and all kinds of things. My question is about, 5 or 8 years ago, we had a huge fire in the Columbia Gorge, going down the Columbia River. And it was caused by a high school student who threw some firecrackers at the beginning of a mile up a trail. And everybody blamed the kid. And I felt like we should have taken the blame and the hit, because we were the ones that caused global warming. And these teenagers do stuff. That's just where their mind is. Yeah. So there were about 5 of us who thought that. And then my real question is, are we going after the wrong people with these fires at the electric companies? It's the same kind of concept. Was the kid really guilty, or is the electric company guilty? And I feel like we should be going after the fossil fuel industry instead. What do you think about that?
Well, I think all of the above. I think you're right. The kid who makes a mistake, what are you going to say? But certainly the fossil fuel companies have done everything in their power, especially right now when they have a big ear at the White House, to roll back any limitations on burning fossil fuel. Look, we are actually, we, the taxpayer, are paying billions of dollars to companies not to build wind turbines right now. It's astounding that that's being done.
Yeah, I'm just saying the people that we should be taking to court aren't. Yeah, you're saying it.
Right, and there certainly are some interesting court cases, but the laws are not very amenable to taking ExxonMobil to court for this. But you raise a different point, which is interesting to raise. This idea is you should blame us. But that's part of the PR program. Everyone remembers the campaign, only you can prevent fire, or the pollution, litter campaigns. Don't be a litter bug. Pick up your litter. But that was all being promoted by companies that make single-use plastics, so you throw them out. rather than saying, why don't we have a system where we don't produce these things that we don't really need, and they're causing these other problems. And so we have to rethink that, because we've been taught to blame ourselves for some of these things, but really it's the system that's being run by people who really figured out how to maximize the profits for these corporations. So.
Yeah, my name is Les Grady. I had a 40-plus career in academia. I was a professor of environmental engineering, focusing on wastewater treatment and specifically the impacts of synthetic organic chemicals in those treatment systems and their fate in those treatment systems. I had research funded by EPA, by the National Science Foundation, by DuPont, by Procter & Gamble. I retired in 2003, but then finally quit my overall activities in 2010. So I'm a little bit away from what's happening now, but I have read just with abhorrence what's happening to the research infrastructure in this country. On the one hand, am glad that I'm no longer having to find funding, but at the same time, wish that there was something that I could do about it other than write to my strongly Republican congressman. With regards to engineers and scientists, I think one of our main problems is that as long as we're active researchers, we are discouraged from being advocates, primarily because maybe it's a self-imposed reluctance because we don't want to damage our chances of getting funding. I have found, though, that National Science Foundation, EPA, both they were always very objective in their reviewing of proposals. I never experienced any form of political problems with that. From the companies that funded my research, I never had any form of pressure.
Sir, could you ask a question, please?
Yes, well, I really since the scientists know, I could name a number of people who we knew that were just we couldn't trust their work. We knew that they were shills. So how do you change the atmosphere so that the scientists and the people that are doing the work and know what's going on are more willing to step forward and reveal those folks that are the shills?
Well, I think, very briefly, I think there's a lot of change among scientists. I talked about that White House proposal. 500,000 people have commented on that, mostly scientists. There's an organization called Stand Up for Science, which is really leading a lot of this. And scientists have realized their voices have to be heard. So there's certainly much more of that.
Hello, my name is Charles Sontag. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I'm now living in Bloomfield, New Jersey. One quick comment, then one question. The comment that I have is there's always room for the superstars, but what are the rest of us going to do that are going to go down with the ship? This is the thing that people are like, oh, we're going to lose our lead scientists. We've got a lot of great scientists, and many of them are not going to escape. Second, I see the fairness doctrine and its elimination during the Reagan era as a rise to all sorts of bad behavior, especially with the propaganda shows like Fox News and others presenting the industry research. Would returning to the fairness doctrine be a goal for a future administration?
Great question, and I have no idea because I don't really follow the fairness document, but perhaps others can think about that. Sorry, but...
Okay, I'm short. Hi, I'm Carrie Jacobus, and I was the AP Chemistry and Organic teacher in a high school in Bergen County, New Jersey. Riverdale High School is where I ended up. And I want to address something you said at the beginning when when people were taught how to handle the job they do. Not everybody learns alike, because all the custodians and the science teachers had to go to the same workshop at the beginning of the year. And one day I'm smelling toluene. Toluene is in spray paint, so I give my kids, my class, a bunch of questions to do, say, get in your group, and I walk out, and I walk down the hall, and there is the custodian, this far from the drop ceiling, and he's spray painting it. I had grabbed a mask before I went out, and I said, Mike, what are you doing? You went to the same class I did. This stuff is going to kill you. But they don't understand. Even though people that are knowledgeable are telling them, they don't get it. You know, because I saw it in the people that were educated just like we were. They don't have an education, and they think they can do whatever they want. They don't understand how deadly it is. So just be aware.
Well, thank you.
I've seen the same thing.
Okay.
Hi, Bruce McNair from Stamford, Connecticut. I am not a journalist, but I've worked with a few through the years, and I know that the good ones try very, very hard as a part of their professional standards to present a balanced picture. That, you know, if somebody likes guns, I need to find somebody who doesn't like guns. If 999 people think the world is round, I need to find the one person who thinks it's flat and get a quote and include them in the article. And that have really been used as a weapon against ethical professional journalists, and I'm not sure what the solution is.
Yeah, but we call that both-siderism, and I think there's a lot of discussion in the journalist community, especially around these science issues, that we know that the industry will always pay someone to say it, and they will promote them, but you don't need to include their position if the overwhelming science says one thing. So.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Robert Del Zoppo from Syracuse, New York. I spent over 40 years in academic and not-for-profit research in computer science and mathematics, and been involved with a lot of environmental groups. So I think probably knowing this audience, most, if not all, went to a March for Science at some point. But a particular march, call it a protest if you will, but one of the things that just became clear to me taking part in those is that we all need to do a much better job because we want change at the top, but as our voice is better heard from the bottom up, not just from the top down. So in amplifying our voice, two things became clear to me. One is we have to be insistent to our local leaders that the right people are at the table for these discussions. And the second point is that we have to prioritize, we have to amplify our voice in choosing the right people as politicians that can support this. Now, one of the things I noticed is that the local leadership took note of this, and it was in their agenda going forward. So I have hope that this could work. That's what I'm saying.
Well, thank you.
But I think we have to do a better job, too.
This is going to have to be the last question. And be better than me.
I hope this will suit them. It's a good last question. My name is Will Port. I'm from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I've served in the military and the civil service for 40 years. My congressman, this is a name some of you may know, is Freedom Caucus stalwart Scott Perry.
Scott Perry.
And my senators are other names you might know, John Fetterman and Senator McCormick. I have never felt more helpless in my life at watching what has happened in our government in the past 8-10 years regarding facts and the lack of operating in a fact-based world. In your research, do you know of any time in our history that we've ever been in this situation in the modern times from World War II, and how do we recover from it?
No, I think in terms of facts and science, we've never seen anything like this. I mean, certainly with World War II and Vannevar Bush, and there was a whole movement to really recognize the importance of science in building our society, our economy, and our national defense. And that's really been destroyed. I mean, certainly there was attacks on academia and the public in the McCarthy period, but nothing like this. But thank you all for...
Thank you. Next week, we're going to hear from someone who's going to offer us some thoughts on possible solutions, but solutions that have problems that come with them. We're going to be looking at nuclear energy. We need help to keep doing this. Help is simple. There's something you can do that is easy to do. Put some money in the little basket in the back so we can keep doing these talks. But the other thing, I look at us and we all care and we all know, and a lot of the things that we're worried about, if I get more microplastic in me, it's not going to kill me. But 2-year-olds, we need to worry about them. But I'm convinced that the solutions to these big problems require that the 15-year-olds and the 25-year-olds and the 35-year-olds have to get off their damn social media and start working, organizing, and doing things to actually solve problems rather than sitting on their butts communicating with one another. If you can help do that, that will be a big contribution. But thank you for being here.